All right, and today we will be discussing, does the respondent task or number of attributes affect the results of a max diff? Your presenter is Dr. Cunha, as well as some MMR candidates. So I will let you guys take it away, and I will enable the share screen. So you should be able to share your screen now.
Can you see our screen?
I can, you're good.
Wait, is that in the way, the window? Okay, cool.
So we're good to get started?
You are good to go.
All right. Thank you, Amber, and thanks, Bill, for inviting us. This has become a tradition now. It's the third year that we're presenting this interesting research on research projects, which we have presented on scales and also whether collecting the data just in one day or on multiple days affects the results of your research. So this year, we're going to be talking about max diff. Here's the team that worked with me on this project, our MMR students. And today, Jackie and Jody are going to be leading the presentation. For those of you who are not familiar with the MMR program, so if you want to further your career in marketing research, that's going to be a great option for you. Our program was founded in 1979 and it's considered a standard in the industry. And we are the premier program that develops the talent for both client and supplier insights and research jobs. So I will now hand the presentation over to Jody and Jackie. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much. All right. So how did we even get to this research question of does the respondent task or the number of attributes affect the results of a max diff? So Dr. Cunha was teaching a class on applications in marketing research, and he was introducing max diffs to us. And I raised my hand and I was like, wait a second, does it matter if I put in 3 attributes or 5 attributes for a max diff? And he says, you know what, that make a great research on research presentation. So here we are. And while I'm here, I'd also like to give a shout out to AYTM for being a great platform partner to us. So all the research was programmed and fielded using AYTM. All right, so let's get into the nitty-gritty details of the experimental design. So it is a 2x2x2 mixed design. So it has a mix of both monadic and sequential monadic aspects to it. So there's 4 total experimental conditions. We'll go into that a little bit more on the following slides, but there are basically 2 ranking types. So either the respondent's task is to reorder the attributes that they're shown or select the best or the worst of the attributes. And then there's either they're shown 3 attributes or 5 attributes. So again, this will make a little bit more sense when we show some examples, but this is basically how we set it up. And then we have 2 different industries that they were shown. So that part is sequential monadic, meaning that they saw both industries. So one industry is air travel or flights, and then the other one is dining at a restaurant. So talking a little bit more about our sample and randomization, in terms of the sample, we had a total of 800 participants and 200 within each experimental condition. So once the respondents were qualified into our survey, they were randomly assigned to one of the 4 experimental conditions. And then the order of the max diff was randomized. So whether they saw the max diff on the flights or the air travel, or whether they saw the one about dining at restaurants first, that aspect was randomized. All right, so here are the 4 experimental conditions that I mentioned earlier. So in our first condition, the respondents that qualified and came into this saw either flights or restaurants first for their max diff, and they either had to do the task of reordering the attributes based on their preference for either 3 attributes or 5 attributes. And then in the second condition, it was similar task of reordering, except this time they saw it with 5 attributes. Going on to our third condition, it was they had to select the best or worst within the max diff that they saw, and they saw this with the 3 attributes. And then lastly, our fourth condition was they selected the best or worst with 5 attributes. And something else to keep in mind, that the respondents were balanced based on gender, age range, and region. All right, so what did our survey actually look like in AYTM? So before the respondents were qualified into our survey, they were asked 2 pre-qual or screener questions. So the first question was, on average, how frequently do you go out to eat for a sit-down dinner at a restaurant? And for the users that selected I don't dine out, or I dine out less than once a month, they were kicked out of the survey at that point. And then the second pre-qualification question asked about, in a typical year, how many times do you travel domestically by plane? And for those people who selected I don't travel via an airplane, or I travel via an airplane less than once a year, they were also kicked out of the survey at that point. And then the actual MaxDiff questions, what did they look like? So the question regarding dining at restaurants, that kind of appeared as, when dining out, what features are most or least important in influencing the overall experience? And then when the respondents saw that, they either saw that again with the 3 or 5 attributes, and then either their task was to reorder it or select best or worst. And then coming to what that looked like for our air travel or flight industry type of the MaxDiff. For that, it said, when booking a flight, what factors are most or least impactful when deciding which flight to choose? So let's jump into what that actually looked like on the respondents' end. So for the first condition, when they saw those 3 attributes and they saw they had to reorder it. This is kind of what it looked like. So for the 3 options, they had the option to select it and drag it to be able to reorder. So that's what those dots on the side represent. And then it says that instruction of drag up or down to reorder. And then for our second condition, very similar interface, except this time it has those 5 attributes. And then coming to our third condition is they had to select the best or worst. So obviously this looks a little bit different than the reordering task, but here basically when the respondent hovers over to select what their best is, so they indicate that thumbs up with that. And once they have selected their best, then I'll leave the other options to be able for you to select that as a thumbs down to indicate your worst. So these examples are all for condition 3 in terms of the 3 attributes shown, and the interface will look exactly same for those who qualified into condition 4, except they would have 5 options to select their best or worst from. All right, now that we've made it through all of this, I'm going to move it over to Jackie to tell you what we actually found from our experiment.
All right, so getting into the data, just quick background. AYTM, after running the MaxDiff, outputs the utilities for each of the attributes within each of the industries, the flights and the restaurants. So we took those utilities and we plugged them into the likelihood function to get probabilities of choosing each, and then converted to indices as well, so we could see how they compared against each other. And that was what we ended up working with for our significance testing. So first, we wanted to look with interactions between the selection style and the attribute. And just for visual representation, this is sorted in descending order by the best worst category, showing 3 options. The first is the highest index for proximity, lowest being value. But what we wanted to test was there a difference based off of best worst or reorder? So when we bring in the reorder, you can start to see there is some interaction in the pattern as they go along. And that's represented in these middle options here: service, menu, size, ambiance. These numbers here are the rankings of the order that they're presented in, again, sorted by the best worst option with showing 3. And we saw that this was true for both showing 3 and 5. There is an interaction effect in that the order difference throughout the attributes in their order. And we also did this for the flight industry and saw the same effects. And you can see these start to present themselves in the middle, but not really any indication as to where in the middle, just not on the end caps. So the interactions are shown when the crossovers in the lines here, as well as the third option is ranked as the 5th option here, and so on. So there is a significant effect on the selection style being best worst or reorder on the attribute order. We also wanted to look at is the number of attributes causing an interaction effect on the attribute order. And so just again, sorting in descending order for best worst with 3 options. We also added in, the best worst 5 options, and you can see there is some variation in the order in the center as well. So the second most important attribute, being company, was the third most important attribute when showing 5 different categories. And same is true for 3 and 5 within the reorder section. You'll probably notice that all of the options for the best worst with 3 options shown are a little bit higher, which makes sense because when only showing 3 options, the probability of selecting one of these attributes is higher amongst only 2 other options versus when showing 4 other options in the case of being 5 total attributes. And again, we saw that this was the case within the flight industry questions as well. So there is some variation in the order throughout these in-between attributes as the order goes on for their index score. So to summarize, the attribute ranks at the endpoints tend to be in the same score. They aren't changing depending on whether we're showing a rank order or a best worst. And the in-between attributes is where we really see some variation. And this might be due to the fact that those NCAP ones people feel more strongly about, but because people don't have as strong of preferences in the internal and in-between options, they're more likely to be affected by the way that they are asked the question. How could this impact you in your work? Really, you just need to be aware that these results can vary based on how you're asking the question, how many options you're showing. There's no one best way to do it. There was no indication as to 5 options being better than 3, or it's better to show a reorder versus a best worst option. But it is important that you be consistent, whichever one you choose to go with, in case the attribute levels orders would change over time based off of how you're asking the question versus what the actual preferences are. Some limitations we did factor in when doing our analysis. There might have been some sample bias. One, in that AYTM is an online panel, so only accessible to those that have technology, but more so that we only had our survey open for a short window of time. So some availability bias, in that if it was only open for a few short days, that might have limited some of the respondents. As well as we fielded our survey in January 2023. So this might have impacted people's preferences on dining out, or if people are traveling more in January, how they feel about certain attributes. So going off of that, if we were to continue with this research, we think it would be really interesting to make it into a longitudinal study and see how these trends happen to change over time. We noted that all of the changes happen in the center variables, not the NCAP, so not the first most important or the least important attribute, but just in the middle. And while there was no distinct pattern that we could clearly state now, something might emerge over time, in that the attributes only change in the very middle, or only right after the least important and the most important. And then we also think it would be really interesting to look at more niche or polarizing topics for MaxDiff study. So if there is a topic that people feel more strongly about and have stronger opinions, then how would that impact the results in the order of each attribute level? So that is all we have. Does anyone have any questions?
So before questions, I just wanted to add that the reason why we decide also to focus on MaxDiff is because there's really a great amount of interest in this technique. There's a lot of growth of use of MaxDiff, so it's important that we develop our knowledge on research, so people can understand what are the potential pitfalls and caveats from these different techniques or the different type of surveys that you're using. So we'll continue to do this kind of research. Also, the fact that technology is becoming widely available to many people that perhaps do not have the adequate training to understand MaxDiff. So platforms like AYTM that allows for do-it-yourself MaxDiff, and they do a great job of doing that. So it's important that people get educated on the process, and also educated on the implications of your interpretations when you are considering doing a max diff, which is a much more accessible technique that takes into consideration the idea of trade-offs, which is a lot more complex when you do a conjoint, right? But it has the great advantage of being scale invariant, right? So relative to when you ask people to rate attributes, right? The scales could vary as a function of different factors. So, for example, some countries might be, generally speaking, more optimistic than others. So, if you ask the same people from different cultures to rate attributes on a 1 to 7 scale, you might get means that are very different because the ratings and the scales used, they are scale variant. They will depend on the characteristics of the respondents. Max diff tends to be a technique that kind of standardize those ratings, and then you can look at the data more globally. Also in that case, and also it's great that with the development of hierarchical Bayesian max diff, you can now get individual utilities for everybody that takes your survey. What does that mean? That means like we saw like the aggregate utilities here for different attributes for restaurants and flights, but we also, if we look into the data granularly, I could see that the utilities for Jody in terms of flying are very different than those for Jackie, right? So they might, overall, we know the utility of the attributes, but per respondent, those utilities might vary greatly. So, and what's the implication of that? Well, that's a great opportunity for segmentation, right? So we can create now segments based on the individual utilities if you use a hierarchical Bayesian max diff technique from which you can extract individual utilities. So it's a great technique. I think better for the most, I'm not saying like don't use attribute ratings, but in some instances it might be better than attribute ratings because force people into some sort of trade-offs. And we just discussed some basic max diffs. They're like anchor max diffs and variations of max diff that improve the estimation of the utilities. And but also it might not be as time consuming from the respondent standpoint or resource consuming from the people who are paying for the study when you compare to a conjoint study. So great technique, add that to your toolkit of market research. But as we try to teach the students here, don't build a wall just so you can use your power drill, right? Just make sure you have a wall that needs to have a hole in it, so you use the tools that you have available. So I think with that, we'd like to open for questions from the audience.
Okay, I see some coming in the chat. Someone was just asking for a little bit further information on AYTM. I know you were kind of starting to get into that a little bit, Dr. Cunha, but like, is this a free service? What does it offer? How accessible is it, et cetera?
Okay, so we have a partnership with AYTM that stands for Ask Your Target Market, so AYTM.com. They are a great platform to develop your survey, max diff, conjoint. You have like the same capabilities you'd get from Qualtrics. I think one thing that they differentiate themselves relative to Qualtrics, and they do a very good job at the automation on the part of the analysis. So they do like, immediately when you have your data collected, you can get a great amount of analysis, whether it's a conjoint, a max diff, or just, frequencies. And they also allow you to export the data, of course, to SPSS and Excel. And they have their own panel. And it's a great partnership with our program because we not only have the access to their full license, but we also have access to their panel. prior to our partnership with AYT, and they have a panel, I think, of over 40 million people on their panel. Prior to our partnership with AYTM, we used to have, students would have to ask their friends, post on social media to, complete their survey so they could complete their projects. Now, with our partnership with the AYTM, we can specify demographics, and they also starts giving a sense. They say like, hey, with this many questions and this many participants, your cost per interview is going to be $5. So also students start learning, and you're going to have your survey by 5 p.m. today. You make the survey more complex, it will adjust that. Make it more simple, you adjust that estimate. That also help our students to learn about the trade-offs that they are going to be facing in their careers. I have no idea of what their pricing is, and I don't know if they have a freemium version of their product, but you can reach out to them. They're great at customer service. And the person that worked with us, with their EDU person, Morgan, she's great working with our students. So it's another great tool for you to take a look at. And if it works for you, I would suggest you sign up for it.
Thank you. Someone else asked, do you think the device used to take the survey has any impact, i.e. a computer versus a mobile? Is it better to use 3 attributes for a mobile and 5 for a desktop?
So I think, I don't know if you guys want to answer. I can start answering.
I think my perspective on this would be that because AYTM already has it like optimized for mobile devices as well, like it's at the point where you can see all the options in your screen and your frame itself. So when you're actually previewing and testing it, you can see how that looks on the mobile device versus like a computer. So personally, I don't see that there would be that much of an impact between the two. But I don't know what you wanted to add.
I think when they would get their data, do we get the kind of device?
I don't think we get what they take it on.
We can probably get that. That would be a great question. We could add that variable to our analysis and see if there is differences. What we can tell is if there is differences. It's practically impossible to say what's better, right? So to figure out what's better, we need to have a standard of comparison. What's the ideal? So for example, if you know something is an error, right? Then we would see, oh yeah, there are more errors when you do 3 attributes versus 5. But without a standard of comparison or benchmark, it's hard to say which one is better. Perhaps you could see something that, that for flights, people would prefer prices. Most people would prefer prices to be lower than higher, right? Now, if you see a higher proportion of people rating higher prices as more preferable for 3 attributes than for 5, then perhaps there is, you might make the inference that because this can be assumed to be an error, but there might be people that prefer pay more so they can go on first class, that 3 versus 5, 3 or 5 is better based on that. The important thing would be to define what's the standard of comparison against which 3 or 5 are being compared. So then we can make a claim about which one leads to fewer errors or better estimation of utilities.
Okay, and I just had a personal question. I always like to ask this when anyone's conducting research. Was there anything that surprised you while you were conducting the research?
We also wanted to see if there were any differences across gender, and it turned out there wasn't, which we thought there might have been, at least in the order, but there really wasn't any significant differences between males and females on preference order or the levels of which things came out based off of how we showed it. So I think that was an interesting finding. Is there anything else?
I think I would say that.
Also a question that also, I'm throwing this curveball to you guys. I always ask you guys in our classes, after you do a project, now that you've done the project and you learned through it, through the conducting the project, is there anything you would have done differently?
I mean, based off this last question, would have maybe added in a few other questions to evaluate covariance and see if there were other factors we could test on. Are you a Mac user versus an HP user? Is there any effect there on the results? And maybe other things that we could have looked at. So maybe doing more, but making more work for myself.
Totally. I know that we've done like a pre-survey before we even started this to be able to identify which topic we should use and which attributes we should use. I think it would be interesting to go back and before we started this to have like looked at the different attributes that we put in, maybe do some qual beforehand to identify if there were any other attributes that would have maybe helped determine more attributes on either points. So I know we had like our first and last pretty much stayed the same, but if we had more researched attributes and they were more like preferred by respondents, then if that would change the number of attributes that kind of stayed at those endpoints. So I think that would have been interesting to see.
Yeah, we also tried to do 2 industries that were to some extent different, and also they had different numbers of attributes, because we can also see like having 10 attributes presented, 5 times versus 7 attributes presented 5 times. Does that really matter? And then our initial analysis, which we did a repeated measure analysis of variance, there is no 3-way interaction between the 2 factors of interest and the industry. So it doesn't seem like the overall number of attributes seems to have an impact on the overall ordering of the attributes as a function of how they were presented.
Alrighty, well, thank you guys so much for your time and sharing us all these cool findings with us. We appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I'll also like to tell you guys that Jody and Jackie are going to be joining the industry as soon as they graduate. Jody is going to be with Merck Pharmaceutical, and Jack is going to be with Olson Zeltman. They do the ZMAT analysis in Pittsburgh.
Woo, congratulations.
Thank you.
For researchers, we love that.
All right, thanks for the opportunity once again. Thanks, Bill and Amber, for supporting on this, and we'll start working on the research for next year.
All right, thank you. You guys have a great day.
All right.
Awesome, thanks.
Bye.